Every year, as the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, she embarked on her solemn journey to the cemetery where her husband lay in eternal repose. It was a tradition born of love and loss, a pilgrimage she undertook with a heavy heart and a soul burdened by grief. The night was thick with fog as she made her way through the winding paths of the graveyard, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant wail of a lone owl. Her footsteps echoed softly against the cold ground, each one a solemn reminder of the passage of time and the weight of her sorrow. Finally, she reached the familiar plot of land where her husband's tombstone stood, a silent sentinel in the darkness. With trembling hands, she brushed away the fallen leaves and traced her fingers over the weathered letters of his name, her heart heavy with memories of a life lost too soon. But as she leaned in to read the inscription, a chill ran down her spine. For there, carved into the cold stone alongside her husband's name and dates, was her own. A wave of fear washed over her as she stared in disbelief, her mind reeling with questions and doubts. Who had dared to inscribe her name upon that cursed tombstone? And what sinister purpose lay behind such a macabre gesture? As the minutes stretched into hours, she found herself consumed by a gnawing sense of dread. The darkness seemed to press in around her, suffocating her with its oppressive weight. And though she longed to flee, she knew deep down that she could not leave until she had unraveled the mystery that lay before her. With trembling hands and a racing mind, she began to scour the graveyard for clues, her senses heightened by the fear that gripped her soul. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence, every whisper of the wind a sinister omen. But try as she might, she could find no answers among the tombstones and mausoleums that surrounded her. And as the hours wore on and the night grew darker still, she felt the icy fingers of despair closing in around her. Then, just as she was on the brink of despair, a voice pierced the silence, sending shivers down her spine. "Who dares disturb the slumber of the dead?" it whispered, its tone both menacing and seductive. With a start, she turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, its features obscured by the darkness. Fear clutched at her heart as she stumbled backward, her mind racing with terror. "Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. But the figure only laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "I am but a servant of the darkness," it replied, its voice dripping with malice. "And you, dear child, are but a pawn in a game much larger than yourself." With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, she realized that she was not alone in that cursed graveyard. And as the figure drew closer, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light, she knew that her fate was sealed. For in the heart of the night, amidst the crumbling gravestones and the whispers of the dead, she had stumbled upon a truth more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. And try as she might to escape, she could not outrun the darkness that awaited her at every turn. As the figure drew closer, its presence seemed to suffocate the very air around her, filling her lungs with dread. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, desperate to escape the sinister being that loomed before her. But no matter how far she ran, it was always there, its gaze burning into her soul like a flame in the darkness. And with each passing moment she felt her resolve weakening, her spirit bending beneath the weight of its malevolent presence. "Why have you come here?" the figure demanded, its voice echoing through the night like a funeral dirge. Trembling, she struggled to find the words to reply, her mind clouded by fear and confusion. What did this creature want from her? And what dark purpose had brought it to this cursed graveyard in the dead of night? I came to visit my husband's grave," she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. But the figure only laughed, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Your husband?" it sneered, its lips twisting into a cruel smile. "Do you truly believe that he rests in peace?" A chill ran down her spine at the mention of her husband, her thoughts turning to the man she had loved and lost so long ago. Was it possible that his spirit still lingered in this place, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead? Before she could ponder the question further, the figure stepped forward, its eyes ablaze with an unholy light. "You see," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Your husband was but the beginning, and now it is your turn to join him in eternal torment." With a blood-curdling scream, she turned and fled into the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest as she raced through the labyrinth of tombstones and mausoleums. But no matter how fast she ran, the figure was always there, its presence looming ever closer, like a shadow at her heels. And as the night wore on and her strength began to wane, she realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escape from the darkness that had consumed her soul. For in the heart of the graveyard, amidst the crumbling gravestones and the whispers of the dead, she had stumbled upon a truth more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. And try as she might to resist, she could not outrun the fate that awaited her in the depths of the night. As the relentless pursuit continued, her breath grew ragged, her legs heavy with exhaustion. Each step felt like a struggle against an invisible force, pulling her deeper into the darkness. With one final burst of desperation, she stumbled upon a forgotten crypt, its entrance partially concealed by overgrown ivy. Without hesitation, she threw herself inside, praying that it would provide sanctuary from the horrors that pursued her. In the dim light of the crypt, she huddled in the corner, her body trembling with fear. Outside, the night seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for some unseen signal to resume its relentless assault. Hours passed in agonizing silence, broken only by the distant howl of the wind and the pounding of her own heart. But just as she began to hope that the nightmare was over, a voice whispered in the darkness, sending shivers down her spine. "You cannot hide from me," it murmured, its tone filled with malice. "I am everywhere and nowhere, the darkness that lurks in the deepest recesses of your soul." Tears stung her eyes as she pressed herself against the cold stone walls of the crypt, her mind consumed by despair. How had it come to this? What dark forces had brought her to the brink of madness in this forsaken place? But even as the darkness closed in around her, she refused to surrender to despair. With a strength born of desperation, she whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, pleading for salvation from the horrors that threatened to consume her. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded, leaving her alone in the silence of the crypt. With trembling hands, she dared to peek outside, half expecting to find the figure waiting for her in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the pale light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the stone walls, a promise of a new day dawning on the horizon. With a sigh of relief, she stepped out into the cool morning air, her heart still heavy with the memory of the horrors she had faced. But as she made her way out of the graveyard, she knew one thing for certain. Though the darkness may linger in the shadows, she would never again be its prisoner. For in the heart of the night, amidst the crumbling gravestones and the whispers of the dead, she had found the strength to face her fears and emerge victorious. And though the scars of that fateful night would never fully heal, she knew that she would carry the light of hope with her wherever she went, a beacon in the darkness for all who dared to follow in her footsteps.